Ladies and gentlemen, today's topic is going to be early constitutions, which accompanies Chapter 2, Section 3 in your Magruder's textbook. Last we left off, you had been talking about the Declaration of Independence, which is certainly an important component on our path to creating a new nation. But we're going to back up a little bit now and go to January of 1776, when New Hampshire was the first colony to officially adopt a constitution. South Carolina followed 3 months later, and then by May 10th of 1776, the Continental Congress urged each of the colonies to adopt representative governments put in place by constitutions. Pictured below here, you can actually see the initial copy of the Constitution of New Hampshire, which was created by its own Congress. What exactly is a constitution? Certainly, it's a word we hear a lot in this nation, and we're talking about today's United States Constitution. We utilize a capital C because it is a proper noun. But a constitution in general is a body of fundamental laws that set out the principles, structures, and processes of the government. Quite simply, it's a document that tells how the government is going to run. Back in that day, as today, assemblies were commonly called to create or adopt these documents. And an interesting little tidbit, in case you ever get on Jeopardy, Massachusetts actually has the oldest surviving constitution in the world. It was drafted in 1780, and although it's been amended since then, the original constitution that was drafted in 1780 in Massachusetts still forms the backbone of the document that they govern with today. Common features of these new state constitutions involve the following: the principles of popular sovereignty, limited government, civil rights and liberties, and separations of powers and checks and balances. These are things that you've all previously heard of. And just to summarize what you should know about each of these for your notes, popular sovereignty basically says that the government can exist and function only with the consent of the governed, basically meaning the people have the power. Limited government means that the government is not all powerful. It only receives certain powers that have restrictions. Civil rights and civil liberties, of course, are something that I think you can all describe, but basic rights that the government must respect for the people at all times. 7 out of the 13 new constitutions contained a very specific Bill of Rights, and that, of course, is ultimately going to shape our federal constitution. And then lastly, separation of powers. Power is divided amongst 3 branches: an executive, legislative, and judicial. And each of those branches is given powers with which to check the other branches of the government. If you'd like, you can pause this here to take a moment and fill in your charts. Some other common features of the early state constitutions were that state governors were given little power. This was due to the negative experience that many of the states had with previous colonial governors. Most of the authority was in turn given to a legislator, because that legislative body was elected by the people. And they typically kept those elective terms of office very short, usually no longer than 2 years, something that is carried over into our House of Representatives today. Back then, only adult male property owners could vote. So in most colonies, soon to be states, only about half of the adult population could actually register and vote, if registration was even an option in that colony. Now, our very first national constitution is not the constitution that we're governed by today. In fact, it had a completely different name. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Hopefully you remember this from US and Virginia history last year. The first national constitution was actually created during the Revolutionary War by the Second Continental Congress. Recognizing that they were now believing themselves to be their own country, they knew they needed a national constitution. It took them 17 months to put it together, and it was finally approved in November of 1777. However, it did not go into effect immediately. It required ratification. Ratification is a word that you're going to be hearing a lot throughout this unit. To ratify something means to formally approve it. And 11 of the states agreed within 1 year to ratify the Articles of Confederation. Although this sounds like a rather long time frame, keep in mind that at this time a war was being fought, and also news didn't travel as fast back then as it does today. Delaware added its approval in mid-1779, and the last state to ratify the Articles of Confederation, Maryland, did so in February of 1781. Thus, the Articles of Confederation went into effect on the first of the following month, on March 1st, 1781. So what exactly did these articles do? Well, they established a firm league of friendship between the states. Each state kept its own unique identity, but cooperated for defense, securing liberties, and other items of mutual welfare. The articles were very simplistic in design, creating only one branch of government, a Congress that was unicameral, meaning one house, uni for one, and cameral for house in Latin. Delegates to that Congress were chosen yearly by a different method in each state, but regardless of how many delegates a state wished to send or how they chose them, each state only had one vote, regardless of its size or wealth. So essentially, an equal voting system, much like we have in our Senate today. Congressional power under the Articles was as follows. The Congress could declare war and make peace treaties. They could send and receive ambassadors to foreign nations. They could borrow money and set up a monetary system, build a navy, raise an army, but to do either, they had to ask the states for troops. And by the way, the states didn't have to give them. They could also fix uniform standards of weights and measures, something that was important back then because particularly with measures, they were at the whim of the king. And essentially, if a king's foot was 8 inches, a foot was considered 8 inches. If the next king had a 10-inch foot, a foot was now 10 inches. And so it was very hard to have standardization. And so that was something that people wanted under the new Congress. Congress could also settle disputes among the states and appoint postmasters, carrying on the system that had been started by Ben Franklin during the pre-revolutionary era. Under the Articles, there was not an executive or judicial branch. Congressional committees handled all of these functions. And although each year Congress would choose a president from its membership, this person was the president of the Congress of the Confederation, not the president of the United States. So, what were the states' obligations? Well, by agreeing to the Articles, they promised to obey them. The states were also supposed to support any act of Congress and were supposed to provide troops and funds when Congress requested them. They were also to treat other citizens in the United States fairly and respect the actions of other states. The states were also supposed to surrender fugitives to any other state, allow interstate disputes between states to be settled in Congress. They were supposed to permit open travel and trade amongst each other and also retained any powers not explicitly given to Congress. The states themselves were in charge of promoting the life, property, and general welfare of their people. Unfortunately, although this list seems lengthy, there were many weaknesses to the Articles of Confederation. If you need to, once I'm done explaining them, take a moment and pause this slideshow to write them down. One vote for each state, regardless of size, was something that did not make particularly the larger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania very happy. They thought that they should have more influence because of the size and also their contributions to the new nation. Congress was also powerless to lay and collect taxes or duties. They could ask the states for money, but the states were not required to give it to them. Therefore, it was very difficult to actually run the government without any money. Congress was powerless to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, which is ultimately going to be a big problem. There was no executive, no president or presidential branch to enforce acts of Congress. There was no national court system, so laws were applied differently in each of the states. And the only way any of this could be fixed was if all 13 states agreed that it was a problem. I bet if I asked all of you right now to pick one type of pizza to order, most of you probably couldn't even agree on that. So imagine trying to change something as important as a national constitution. Additionally, a 9 out of 13th majority was required to pass laws, so few laws were passed. And remember, in the end, the Articles ultimately only created a firm league of friendship. Now, on October 19, 1781, the Revolutionary War ends, and America's victory is confirmed in 1783, there's a typo on this slide, by the Treaty of Paris. Now that the country is at peace, the country's political and economic problems begin to come into sharp focus, and the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation are brought to the surface. So, what happens? Well, there's fighting amongst the states because they're growing increasingly jealous and suspicious of one another's motives. There's a great refusal to support a central government in any way. Some of the states are making agreements with foreign governments, even though technically this is illegal, and organizing their own military forces rather than contributing to a national military. At one point, George Washington ultimately complains that there are 13 separate nations who are going to get no respect and could be easily conquered. There were also economic issues as well, including the taxing of goods and the banning of trades between states, which was illegal but not enforced. States were also printing their own money with little backing, which meant economic chaos was spreading, debts are going unpaid, and violence breaks out as a result. Take a look in Chapter 2, Section 3 to see what Shays' Rebellion was in 1786. Oh, I did actually add a slide on it. Shays' Rebellion takes place in Massachusetts in the fall of 1786 when Daniel Shays, a farmer, leads a group that makes state judges close their courts and they try to attack a state arsenal. The reason why these individuals were unhappy was because they were losing their land from not being able to pay their debts and taxes because the state kept changing what their money was actually worth. Ultimately, the state militia steps in and stops the rebellion, but they do recognize that laws need to be passed to ease the burden of those in debt. Meanwhile, Maryland and Virginia are both being plagued by bitter trade disputes, and they decide that they ultimately need to take the first steps towards what will be the big change. Against the wishes of Congress, they set up a conference to be held in Alexandria, Virginia in March of 1785. Soon after, Washington invites them to move the meetings to his home. The meetings are so successful in ultimately deciding the trade dispute over the use of the Potomac and Pocomoke rivers between the two states that Virginia decides a national meeting would benefit everyone. And on January 21st, 1786, they issue a call to have one held. The meeting takes place on September 11, 1786, and while representatives from only 5 states attend, it is so successful that those in attendance call for another, hopefully better attended meeting to take place in Philadelphia in 1787. By February of 1787, 7 states commit to bringing delegates to this convention, and by the end of February, Congress gets on board, ordering all states to name delegates. In the end, this meeting would become the Constitutional Convention.